So in this lesson, we'll try to understand this idea of a working memory system in the brain. And first I'm going to describe and show a typical working memory task, and then we'll see what happens when subjects are doing this task if their brain activity is being measured. Now we're going to use this animation here. These cards over in this pile are simply going to be kind of moved over to a pile here. Now I'm going to cover up this pile so that really all you'll see is a sequence of cards. Now let's see what that looks like. So notice then we have a sequence of cards, and in a working memory task the subject might be asked when the cards stop. Here we see the ace is on top. We might be asked to remember the card just before the ace. So if we were to pick this ace up, what's the card underneath? That would be a one-back task. Or the instructions might be to try to remember when the cards stop moving, when the cards stop sequencing, to remember the second card back. That would be a two-back task. Now as you increase the card that you have to remember, so 2 back, 3 back, 4 back, that becomes more and more difficult because we have to keep in mind more cards as the cards sequence by us. Now we'll get this set up here. So here we're just going to look at a static picture. So let's say this was the first card, then the king is going to go over top of that, and then the jack over top of that, and the queen over top of that, and the king over top of that. So when the cards stop, we see the king of diamonds. The one-back task would be to try to keep in mind what the previous card was. The two-back task would be to try to keep in mind what the previous card to that one was. The three-back task would be to try to keep in mind what the third card back is. Of course, that becomes more difficult as the cards are cycling by. We have to keep more and more information in mind. Now this diagram shows what happens when a subject is put into a brain scanning device and then they do this type of task. The zero back is just sort of a control condition where the subject is looking at the top card. In the one back task, the subject had to keep, as the cards were cycling by, when they stopped, had to remember what was the card before the visible card. And the two back task, 2 cards prior to the visible card, and then the 3 back 3 cards. Notice as the task gets more demanding, the red and yellow regions of the brain indicate regions that show greater and greater activity. So as the working memory demands are increased with a 1 back to 2 back to 3 back, certain parts of the brain show increased activity. These are the parts of the brain that are trying to hold those cards in mind, so that we can remember the third back card. And this is a classic working memory task. And so by using tasks like this and measuring brain activity, scientists are able to get a sense of what parts of the brain are involved in this short-term memory system. There are frontal cortex regions and there are parietal cortex regions that are part of this working memory system. In this picture, we'll see another kind of experiment that was performed to study the working memory system. In this case, scientists were interested in recording from individual brain cells in some of these regions that were previously identified as being involved in working memory. So they're going to insert little electrodes and record the electrical activity of single brain cells in some of these regions, while the animal is going to perform a working memory task. The task is as follows. Monkeys are trained to look at a fixation point here, and then an object, in this case a blue square, will flash onto the screen, in this case up in the right-hand corner. Now, the square will disappear, so at time 2 the square disappears, but the monkey is trained to keep fixated on the center location here. The idea is the animal will be rewarded if at time 3, when the little cross disappears, the monkey shifts its eye gaze to the location where the original target appeared. So the monkey's focused here, the blue square comes on, the monkey maintains focus here, the blue square has disappeared. When that little fixation point disappears, the monkey shifts its eyes, it looks up to the right-hand corner, and it would get a reward. And you can train monkeys to do this type of behavior. Now that's a working memory task because the monkey has to keep in mind, during that time period too, has to keep in mind where the target was. It was in the right-hand corner, then it disappeared, and the monkey has to remember, keep it in working memory, the location of that square so that it can direct its eye gaze at time 3. Interestingly, scientists found brain cells that showed an interesting pattern of electrical activity. So down here in this part of the diagram here we see the spikes here would be an indication that the brain cell was making a lot of electrical activity. So it was firing electrical signals. So it was activated. Well, during this time 1 phase here, this is the record of a particular brain cell. It showed some activity for a little bit of this time 1 period, but it wasn't consistent activity. Notice the time 2. This particular brain cell showed consistently high activity for a large chunk of this time 2. And then at time 3, the brain cell gets quiet again. It's as if the activity of that particular brain cell was somehow involved in this task of keeping the position of that target in mind when the target had disappeared. It's as if they were listening in on a brain cell that was involved in the working memory system. So we're going to sort of characterize the working memory system with this sort of abstract box here. We're going to put a box in the frontal cortex, and this will be our symbol for the working memory system, although other brain regions are involved in the system as well. And the idea is the contents of working memory are simply things we're going to put inside the box. Well, now what are the contents of our working memory? Well, our experience of our own working memory includes whatever it is that we're currently thinking about. And these can be things like verbal thoughts or images. So if we're simply having a thought, that would be the content of working memory. We are conscious of having a thought. If we're imagining something, and that's visual imagery, then that would be the content of our working memory. If we're simply looking at something, perceiving the world around us, and we're consciously paying attention to that, that would be the content of working memory. If we have a song in our head, that song would be the content of working memory. If we're having a feeling and reflecting on it, that would be the content of our working memory. Working memory stores information from other brain areas for a short time so that the information can be manipulated, used for long-term memory retrieval, guide attention, or sustain a goal to guide behavior. So this is a really important system in the brain. And it is in communication with other brain systems. So if we're doing visual imagery, it's the visual regions of the brain that are sort of sending information up into the working memory system. If we're having a verbal thought, it's the language regions of the brain that are supplying the contents of working memory. And then whatever's in this working memory system can talk to other parts of the brain to help guide future brain activity. So the frontal cortex systems, along with some parietal cortex systems, provide a temporary workspace for information provided by other brain areas. And then whatever is currently in the working memory system can interact with other brain regions to influence further processing. In the next part, we'll try to understand how it is that an individual brain cell could sustain its activity over a duration like this when the electrical signal of a single brain cell is a very, very fast phenomenon. How could this cell sustain its electrical activity for the length of time on the order of seconds when the electrical activity of brain cells is on the time order of fractions of a second? We'll try to figure that out in the next part.